Support for this program comes from Jazz on the Tube, the Internet's largest collection of free streamable classic jazz videos. From Miles Davis to Louis Armstrong, from Thelonious Monk to Duke Ellington. You'll find it all on jazzonthetube.com. Start your free subscription today.
Hi, this is Ken McCarthy of Jazz on the Tube, and welcome to our podcast series. You know, it takes three elements to create a jazz community, a jazz world. One, the musicians, of course. Can't have jazz without the musicians. The other leg is the audience, and audiences are very important. When you show up at a gig, you are important. Believe me, jazz musicians cannot play, well, they can, but they play best to a full room and a room that's listening. So never underestimate your contribution as a listener. And the third leg of the jazz world are all the people who write about jazz, the scholars, the historians, the reviewers, the chroniclers. They provide a kind of a glue that holds the whole thing together. Now, I've talked with a lot of musicians over the years and some really very well-known advanced musicians, and often they'll say, well, the music speaks for itself. And that is true. However, and that would work great if we lived in a village, but we don't. We live in a very complex society with a lot of stuff going on, and not everybody has the time to chat and talk and share stories around the campfire. We need people to go out and gather this information for us and share it with us. It used to come under the old rubric of music appreciation, which I think I'm going to try to revive, because I think it's a very important contribution to the music scene. Playing, of course, being an audience member, of course, but also adding to music appreciation by writing. And today we have one of the deans of this world of jazz writing, and we're really pleased and happy that he said yes to share some of his time with us and his ideas. His name is Howard Mandel. He is a writer, an editor, an author. He produces for National Public Radio. He's been at this for over 30 years, writes about jazz, blues, and all kinds of music for a wide variety of vehicles, newspapers, magazines, websites. He teaches at New York University, consults with art organizations. He's an author of a book on some of my favorite musicians. We'll talk about that. And he's also president of the Jazz Journalists Association, and you can also find his blog. He blogs at artsjournal.com. So, you know, if you want to talk about jazz writing, we're talking with the right guy. So welcome, Howard, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk a little bit about your career, if I may, and how you found yourself in this position of being a jazz writer. There might be some people out there that love the music, may have a lot of knowledge about it, and maybe they've never, had the courage to put some of that down in words. Everybody's got to start somewhere. Where did you start?
Oh, I always wanted to be a writer, and I started very early, in grade school, trying to write about stuff. And I even had a little newspaper that I put out myself. At that time, I was more interested in reviewing movies, in seventh grade. But I liked writing about things that I saw and took in and heard. And I kept doing that through high school and into college, where I was the counterculture editor of the Syracuse University Daily Orange. And I had been listening to music. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and blues, funk, or soul music was very much in the air, and I followed my ears to what I liked. And I went to the Jazz Record Mart on my 17th birthday, discovered a world of music there, and spent a lot of time there reading liner notes and realizing that I'd like to do something like that to the things that I was listening to. After college, I got a job at the Chicago Daily News as a copy clerk, and eventually was able to start writing for them. And I was really focused on my opportunities to write about music that other people weren't writing about. So that included the concerts by members of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, AACM, and also the AACM, and also salsa music, hot Latin dance music, and blues. I think the first piece I published was about Eddie Shaw's club, the 1815 Club on Roosevelt Road. Eddie Shaw was a blues saxophone player, and Howlin' Wolf was sort of ensconced in his club as the house band. And people seemed to like what I wrote, which led editors to continue to assign me. And, that positive reinforcement went a long way. So that was actually 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago now. I started writing for Downbeat in 1975, and I'm still writing for Downbeat. And I just expanded from there.
You might need to update your website since it's more than 40 years. It's remarkable.
Yeah, I'm afraid my website does need some updating. You're right.
as do they all, including Jazz on the Tube. We're in an endless task of tidying things up. So, Downbeat, you said 1975 is when you started writing for them?
Yes.
So, long affiliation with Downbeat that continues right up to this day.
Yes.
How would you describe Downbeat's place in the jazz world? I mean, in some ways it's a very obvious answer, but maybe you have something else to say about it. I mean, it's been the paper of record for years.
Yes, I don't want to say a lot of critical things about the magazine, although I could. I was an editor there from 78 to 81, so I have some insight into the internal workings. It's been a very important publication. At the same time, it has accepted limits on itself, which I find frustrating to work within. Sometimes I think that Downbeat, which started out as a publication for musicians about their lives, helping the swing band musicians keeping track of each other while they were on the road in the late 30s and the 40s. And, they were really a service magazine for that profession, helping people keep track of tours, opportunities for things like insurance. I think it was owned originally by a couple of guys who selling insurance to these traveling musicians. That changed in around 1960 when it was acquired by the man who had been the printer, John Maher. And when I got into Downbeat, started reading it around 66, 67, it was the principal music magazine in the country. This is before Rolling Stone, and even when Rolling Stone emerged, Downbeat was by far a larger subscription base. And Downbeat is available at Army bases and State Department offices all around the world, libraries. It's established itself as as you said, paper of record, publication of record. Even so, it has, as I said, some limitations about coverage based on its commercial motivation and some strange editorial choices it's made over the years. I often feel that it is focused on high school and college musicians, music students, as its base. And I find that somewhat limits the opportunity to write about the music in a larger context.
Sure.
Something that's more realistic about how life really is. It's problematic. But
well,
what we're dealing with.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but that's what we're dealing with. And, they have tried to keep up with things and to adapt to changing social mores, and, they try hard. I just wish we had a little bit more success at doing that. It's always been difficult to find female writers. I mean, I know I tried to do that when I was editing there. It's also been difficult to attract writers of color, which is surprising, and yet I know many of us have tried to do that. Many of us have sat in that editorial chair. And also covering music from the whole world is very difficult because it's a big world and there's a lot of music.
And there's a lot of jazz coming from all over the world now, too.
Yeah, sure.
I kind of understand their dilemma in a sense is, they've got those presses and, they've got to deliver that pulp somewhere. And the more targeted and consistent they are in how they package and position themselves, the more stable the business is going to be, which of course is a little different than the creative world, obviously. But yeah, I get the same impression too, that it's for kids in band and for band directors, and they found a formula that pays the rent, which is an accomplishment unto itself. Now, when you were editor from 78 to 81, those were some really fertile years in the jazz world. I was a young kid living in New York City then, and the loft scene was sort of in full flower then, and a lot of great young musicians were emerging. Probably the best known one today would be David Murray, but there's a lot of stuff going on then. Was there a similar scene? I imagine there was, of course, with the AACM in Chicago.
A little bit earlier, because a lot of the AACM musicians starting around 72, 73 began to move to New York. They were supplanted by another generation of AACM musicians coming up. But the Art Ensemble, for instance, was no longer living in Chicago as of 73. Mulhall, Richard Abrams had moved to New York around that time. Braxton was gone. Threadgill left a couple years later. So the generation in the late 70s would be like Chico Freeman, Douglas Ewart, Amina Claudine Myers, who'd been involved at the beginning of the AACM, was still here. Fred Anderson was prominent and busy. Yeah, there was a lot of that going on. Also, we had a club called The Quiet Night, which I remember seeing Charles Mingus's. It was a sextet with Don Pullen and George Adams and Hamlet Blewett in that band. Betty Carter, Tony Williams' Lifetime. That was all stuff that happened at The Quiet Night, as well as, I saw Bruce Springsteen there before he became a huge arena rock star.
Uh-huh.
Where else? Well, there's a place called Amazing Grace in Evanston that brought in Kodona and other, more world music type performers that were beginning to come on the scene at that point. The Ivanhoe was another venue, an old restaurant, where I remember seeing Shakti with John McLaughlin on their first tour. So there was a very busy, active music scene. And it's surprising to me, and I kind of roil against it, I've heard a number of people here in Chicago and elsewhere say, well, the 70s, there wasn't really much jazz going on. It was kind of a dead period. And that's simply not true, and it comes out of, I think, Wynton Marsalis arriving on the scene in 82, 83 and saying, there hasn't been any jazz going on for 15 years. And it was just silly. It was silly.
That's a charitable word, silly. While we're talking on this subject, since I've got you, St. Louis and the Black Artist Group, I think the Bowie brothers, Lester and Joseph, came out of that, and I believe Oliver Lake. To me, I had no, other than seeing the product, I have no knowledge of what that scene was about. Do you have any special insight into that world?
Well, I worked with Oliver Lake last year to help him shape up an autobiography that he was working on. So I did get a lot of information from him about what had been going on there. And it's a fascinating story on its own. There has been a book written about it also, which, of course, I'm blanking on the title or the author at the moment. But it has to do with BAG, the Black Artist Group. They had an unusual, strong funding base because of some specific grants that were available to them. I don't know if that was on the state or a private thing, but the dancer Catherine Dunham was in the St. Louis area, and she was able to attract serious funding that BAG was also able to tap into. And they had a building of their own. And the Black Artist Group was not just a musicians cooperative, it also included poets, theater, and dance. So they had looked at the musicians, which included Julius Hempel and Paquita Carroll and several others, Luther Thomas. They looked at the AACM as a model for their organization, but they did do some things a little differently too. That was an all-black group. The AACM was not officially an all-black group, although de facto it was. I think they only had one white member, and there was considerable debate about him being a member for a long time, which Mulhall, to his credit, would always put that conversation off. He never wanted to resolve it.
Mm-hmm.
But Black Artist Group, prior to them officially constituting it, had been a black and white musicians. I think it was called the Creative Music Ensemble, Human Arts Ensemble, maybe. And they put out a couple records that way before they split up and established BAG. But BAG was a force unto itself.
We did a long interview with, I'm sorry, the challenge of telephone interviews. We did an interview with Paul Steinbeck, the author of Message to Our Folks, documentation of the art ensemble, and it's just fascinating to hear how did that enterprise survive? You know, how did it take root? How did it keep going? How did they create an environment for themselves where they could continue in their art in an environment that wasn't necessarily welcoming? I mean, they certainly found audiences for sure, especially in Europe, but it wasn't an easy thing, and yet they persisted and they continued and they developed, and it's just really interesting to hear just the mechanics, because that's an important part of, and you kind of referred to this when we were talking about Downbeat, is there's learning the changes, and then there's learning how to make a living, and also learning if you have a creative bent and want to go beyond the norm, you have to figure out how to make that happen in the real world, and it's a challenge. And some people are more fortunate or better at doing it than others, but it's something that should be discussed, I think, as part of music education. I think more and more, I know, for instance, Berkeley has a entrepreneurial track, and I'm assuming that that's a helpful thing. Hey, talking about writing and about going beyond the norm, you wrote a book called Miles Ornette Cecil, Jazz Beyond Jazz. And I've had the unusual experience of being able to watch an entire Cecil Taylor rehearsal, actually, and I bailed out after 8 hours. It was so intense, I finally had to leave, and there was no indication that these guys were even getting, tired in the least. I mean, it seemed like they were going to go for eternity. Same thing with the way Ornette used to rehearse. I got to visit him on Bowery. He had a loft there, and he was rehearsing Primetime, and it was an all-day affair. It just went on and on and on. It was fascinating. So you've written a book that focuses on Miles, of course, and Ornette and Cecil. Obviously, three giants, but of all the giants that exist, you picked these three. What was your thinking behind that?
Well, I wanted to write about what's considered the avant-garde and what avant-garde really means. And I felt like these were the three people who really had spearheaded innovation in jazz pretty much at the same time. I mean, they're very close contemporaries. And yet they operated in different ways. Their music sound, to me, very different. I know they were different personalities. I had interviewed all of them. And I wanted to kind of bring out something about the milieu, the historical context, which I could do very well by tracing Miles' career, and then show how somebody who didn't have the commercial success of Miles and had not embedded themselves in the tradition in the way that Miles was able to do, changed the music dramatically. That would be Ornette, and the circle of musicians that spun off of him also, I think, have had profound effect. And then somebody who was even considered more remote in a lot of ways than Ornette, and whose music is perhaps thornier still, and who was even more reviled, and who I thought had made great, beautiful music beyond any genre. And how do we listen to that? I mean, I really wanted to give people some keys into what they could do to try to approach Cecil Taylor's music, which is still a huge challenge for even people who like Ornette Coleman. So since I had interviewed them, and since I spent considerable time listening to all of them, and I had not written about them in any depth in my previous book, Future Jazz, I wanted to focus on those and see what I could come up with. So I'm pleased you've looked at it.
Gotcha. I have a hint of how people can access Cecil, he was out at Yoshi's, I think it's called, in Oakland when I lived in San Francisco in the 90s, and I went with a friend who is not a jazz person. She is not a jazz person. And Yoshi's has kind of a bleachers. There's like you can, if I remember correctly, and it's been a long time since I've been there, but there's like a second floor, and we went up there, and there was no one else up there, and we danced. We had no problem, and she had no problem dancing to Cecil Taylor's music. I know that sounds crazy, but there was a swing to it, and I just throw that out there for those who want to explore that. If you'd be interested, I'll just quickly tell you my experience. I was running Indian Navigation in 1980 as just holding it together for Bob Cummins. I mean, it was his thing, and all I did was answer the phone and pick up records at the plant. I really, I was a flunky, but I was the guy that was there. And Cecil had a loft on Chambers Street in those days, and it was being renovated, and he needed a place to rehearse. So he shows up, and he's dressed in sweats, really not, gray sweats with sparkles on them that he had put on, but they were otherwise normal sweats, and proceeded, I exaggerate not one whit, he proceeded to play 3 hours nonstop, full bore. Just, that was his warm-up. And then a drummer and bass player, and I wish I could remember who they were, came, and he worked with them for another 3 hours, at which point Jimmy Lyons showed up. He's been playing 6 hours, and I don't remember a break. They must have taken one, but I can't remember it. Ornette took breaks. I remember those breaks, but I don't remember Cecil taking breaks. And then Jimmy joined in, and like I said, I left after 8 hours because I was exhausted. It was so much. So people want to know where the intensity of those performances and the depth of those performances come from. It's good to know that that's the kind of rehearsing that they did. Let's talk a little bit about the Jazz Journalists Association. You're the president of that now? Is that
still... Yes, I am.
Yep.
Yes, I am.
So tell us what's that about? I mean, it's one of these things that seems obvious on the surface. It's an association of jazz journalists. But how is it organized, and who's a typical member, and what kind of things do you do for members?
Well, it was organized later 80s. There was, looking back, a golden age of jazz journalism at that time. There were a lot of freelancers working for Downbeat, Jazz Is, Jazz Times, and a lot of local magazines and newspapers. And so we were all aware of each other. We'd run into each other at festivals and at gigs, and we thought it would be a good idea to have some sort of group that could represent itself, its members, to publishers if there were any problems, to editors. We used to go out and bowl together after gigs, after festivals, to, be able to have a contact with somebody if you get to a strange city. Where should I get my Chinese food? And this sort of stuff. So it was sort of social, and it had some work options involved also. I was not president for the first 10 or 14, 15 years. I became president in 1992. Nobody's wanted to take it off my hands since then. No, 94, I'm sorry. And what we've evolved into is trying to sustain a high profile of jazz journalism, to let people know that there are people like me, and you, actually, writers, photographers, broadcasters, videographers, people working in new media in whatever format, whose job it is to keep news and views of jazz in the public eye, in public media. And media has changed so much in the last 20, 25 years that we've had to scramble to keep up with it. You mentioned earlier the growth of jazz in other countries. That's certainly been one of the issues. How do we know what's going on elsewhere? How do we keep on track with that? And the Jazz Journalists Association, which has about 200 members currently, including some in Japan, in England, in Germany, a couple in South America, in the Caribbean. I think we still have one in Africa and somebody in Turkey. Anyway, we are in communication with each other, as an association ought to be. We talk about issues that are common to the profession, on a members-only Facebook page, and then we have a public Facebook page, as well as a couple of different websites. JJAnews.org is the main one that is for the public, in which we talk about JJA issues. But what we've done is present awards not only to musicians for the excellence of their endeavors, but also to jazz journalists so that we can highlight who's doing the best work. And also we've been giving Jazz Hero Awards to what we see as activists, advocates, altruists, aiders and abettors of jazz, that is an A-team, all across the country, people who are not typically recognized for their efforts. And we set that up in part to supplant activities during Jazz Appreciation Month, April, because the Smithsonian had dubbed it Jazz Appreciation Month, but people in small communities across the U.S. didn't really have any activities that would gain media attention. Mm-hmm. So with our Jazz Heroes, we stipulate that the hero be presented with an award, which is an engraved statuette, at a public function that some jazz journalists get together, but we open it up to everybody possible, and just to cite them, hoping that the local media will cover them as sort of human interest stories. And that's worked to some extent. So this year, again, we'll have about 24 of these jazz heroes recognized, every place from New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, D.C., Phoenix, all over the place. I can't think of all the cities offhand.
Sure.
Ann Arbor, I guess, Detroit.
It's a great initiative because, as I was saying when we got the call started, the musicians are, of course, paramount. Can't have the music without the musicians. But the gathering and the informing and educating of audiences, and that's what journalists do, but it's also what local heroes do, is really what holds the thing together. Because if we didn't have those people, and luckily they seem to exist in almost every community, we'd have much poorer scene, to say the least. Now, I know it's tricky to single anybody out because there have been so many people that have won the award, and there's so many people that are worthy of specific attention. But could you give us an example of, a classic, let's say, jazz hero, somebody, enmeshed in a particular location? Because jazz is a local art. I mean, it is an international art, obviously, in the sense that people travel around and music comes from everywhere. But ultimately, every community's got to get its own act together, so to speak, venues, events, journalism. Anybody in particular jumps to mind as a sort of a classic example of a local hero?
Emilio Lyons is one of my favorite of the jazz heroes. This guy is the sax doctor of Boston, and he's repaired everybody's saxophone. Coltrane on, finding mouthpieces, adjusting springs, replacing pads, doing all those things. And without a simpatico repairman, our professional musicians who are playing saxes or reeds really are at a loss, and we wouldn't typically think about somebody like that as being a hero, but gosh, they do important work. If you want the horn to sound in tune and you want it to be responsive, and you want to get the best sound you can get, all that, you need a saxophone repair person. And they exist all over the country, But we've given awards to philanthropists, we've given to presenters, we've given to educators, we've given them to devout fans who take it on themselves to do promotion, publicity, sometimes in social media, and club owners, the funders of the Jazz Institute of Chicago, which was a group that included Chase Bank, Kraft Foods, and Boeing for a while. They were supporting the Institute very well. Last year we gave an award to Jack Kleinsinger, who has run Highlights in Jazz, I think, for 40 years. So we've tried to make it very broad and also to represent the diversity of heroes, women, men, black, white, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and just do it broadly. We had last year a family band of Native Americans from the Southwest who got the award in Phoenix. So we've had, it's been vast, and it does activate JJA members and their readers, their audiences, to come together and meet in one place. It's quite a challenge to run a national organization such as ours that is, most of the activities are diffused all around the country. And we are an international, as I said earlier, an international association. It's even more difficult to service people in Russia or in China or Japan or, further flung. We used to have 10 members in Russia, and just trying to keep them on our programs, which are most all online, but we do and we still do, seminars, webinars, and getting people who are, 9 hours away to come into our webinars live is a very difficult time scheduling. Considering in this country we've got like a 4-hour difference between New York and San Francisco, for instance. So when we would schedule a webinar, and we do these webinars as training sessions, discussion sessions of issues, we also post the recordings of those at JJA website, at jjanews.org, so anybody can see them afterwards. We've also had meetings. You asked about things that we do for our members. We've had local meetings, like we had a long series at the New School in New York City, monthly meetings, which would take up a topic, sometimes panel discussions, or a photographer showing us their work and walking us through it. William Gottlieb, the great jazz photographer, did that. Enid Farber has done it. Those are recorded, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to put those up online within the next year.
Oh, great.
We just had sessions on January 13th on women in jazz journalism, social justice issues in jazz journalism.
Oh, great.
And expanding your reach beyond your immediate vicinity. And first of those was videoed, the one on women in jazz journalism. That is currently posted. I'm sure you can find it. It's on YouTube. The Jazz Journalists Association has a YouTube channel, and the other two I'm trying to get up. They need a little editing also.
Gotcha.
So
looking at the 2000 list, women are very well represented, and I think this is something, my impression is, I haven't done a study of, but I think there have been, throughout the years, there have been a lot of women behind the scenes who have facilitated jazz communities and made a lot of things possible. Just going through your list from 2017, I see Viola Plummer in Chicago, Tamika Reed. I see I assume Fran Morris Russman, Andrea Cantor, Judith Corey in Washington, D.C. So maybe in the writing side of things has not yet been a full representation, but clearly in the so-called behind-the-scenes work, women have been essential. I think of the great enterprise, the Jazz Cruise, which was, saved and then nurtured by Anita Berry, as another example. Just so many examples. So it's great that there's a vehicle for these people to get recognized and potentially good press for jazz. It's a way to get jazz into the news, which raises to this issue: how hard is it today versus, because you now have a 40-plus year track record, how hard is it today versus past years to get so-called mass media, if that even exists anymore, mass media attention on jazz and jazz music and jazz musicians and jazz communities?
Well, there's less space in newspapers and magazines. I mean, print publications have just shrunk, the number of them and the amount of space that they have to feature anything. And jazz has a fairly small audience. Money-wise, underfinanced, it has taken a hit. I think that there are maybe 2 full-time jazz journalists employed by mainstream newspapers in the country today. 2.
Versus what would have
Howard
been?
Wright, well, it would have been maybe 40.
Wow.
When I started.
Wow, that's a drop.
I mean, it's huge. And, it makes it harder for freelancers. I mean, I don't know how I would do my job today. There has been a increase in platforms that feature jazz journalism on the web, but unfortunately most of those do not pay.
Right.
So also there were issues like when I was coming up, I would have strategies to increase my income. Like I would think about, okay, I can write this locally. Can I also publish it regionally? Maybe I could publish it internationally and get 3 payments out of one story with a little bit of tweaking in the story. Well, that's really not possible anymore. Because if you publish it locally, it can be on the web in a moment. And you're not going to get another payment for a reprint. So that's problematic. I think that, like jazz itself, jazz journalists work very hard to make sure that we're not going away, that we have a place to express ourselves and to do the work that we want to and need to do. I mean, one of the things I've always admired about jazz, the music, is that regardless of racial biases or being secondary to other forms of music on a financial basis, jazz has persisted. I mean, it doesn't go away. There's so many people who want to play the music. There's so many people who want to listen to it. I mean, okay, we're talking about less than 3% of records bought are jazz records, but gee, jazz music underlies, to me, almost all American music. If it's been made since 1921 in America, there's somebody who put some jazz in it. The soloist in a rock band or a pop band has to know jazz. How else would they know how to solo?
Yep.
You know, we hear this music in commercials. We hear it around us growing up. If you are aware of the American Songbook, you know, Cole Porter and Gershwin's and Irving Berlin, you're hearing jazz there. That's our music. This is, you know, it's everywhere. It's so much so that we often ignore it or overlook it or take it for granted. And, you know, in the same way, it's important that jazz journalists be providing the information, making the connections, bringing out the context, pointing out what's special about this piece or that piece, profiling musicians, keeping their names in the public ear, public eye, that we know what Sonny Rollins has done, that we can talk about Sonny Rollins over a 50-year career, or Ornette or Miles or Cecil. We can bring out the complexities, or just enjoy somebody whose music has immediate appeal, or maybe point out some of the flaws in that immediate appeal, or the contradictions. I mean, all that is like having the conversation and giving the conversation some validity, some sense that it is a real conversation by having it in print or on the air. So I think I'm speaking to the member of the choir here. But,
well, no, it's good. It's really good to say, because, you know, the audience is stratified in terms of, let's say, the amount of time they have to put into it. So someone may love jazz passionately, but maybe they're working 60 hours a week. They don't have time to, you know, listen to all the CDs and read all the background material. So it's so important for writers to exist. Going back to the beginning of the call, it's not the best simile in the world, but it's like the glue that holds it all together. How does a not well-known musician become well-known enough to support themselves with an audience? Well, it usually is writers. I mean, talking about Ornette, you know, Ornette's music did speak for itself. However, there was a lot of writing support for Ornette when he appeared on the scene in '59. That certainly assisted him in developing the career that he did have at that time. So writing is a very important part of this mix, and maybe some of us haven't really thought about that. So,
and for people who don't have any knowledge about how to listen, you know, many people. I taught for 27 years at NYU at New York University, and I would teach. These were minors, you know, classes that people could take just to fill out their credit requirements. But I taught them as if they were major courses. And I would often get people who knew nothing about jazz, but they'd heard about jazz. They live in New York. They ought to have some sort of insight into it. And, you know, they don't know anything. So how do we listen? How do you listen to something? You know, what sense do you make of it? What are the hierarchies? Bass drums. What is the drummer doing? You know, are they just making a lot of clattering noise? I mean, they're very simple things that we can point out, we journalists, who are a bridge between the musicians who know exactly what they're doing, we hope, and an audience that just, like, sits down and turns on the radio or, you know, puts on a CD or streams some music or ends up at a club, and they don't know what they're listening to at all. I mean, there's a little bit of guidance. You used the term music appreciation before. And I think that is kind of a fusty term, but that is what we're doing. We're trying to help people learn how to listen. And that was one of the things when I was a kid. I thought, you know, we live in a very visual society. I love to read. First thing I do in the morning, last thing I do at night is read. But how do we use our ears to gather information? How can we sort that information out? What kind of clues can we get from jazz, especially? And, like you, it sounds like we're about the same age, and in the late 60s, early 70s, there was so much happening socially. And to be able to listen to Miles Davis make On the Corner, which was really a revolutionary record, a real upside-down turn of the way things were being played and heard. And to try to explain that to somebody, especially at that time to moldy figs who didn't have a clue. I mean, you say the Ornette's music was self-revelatory, spoke for itself. That's true, but there's a lot of opposition, even by people who should have been quite open to it. They did not know how to take it. I mean, I'm thinking of the trumpet player, Roy Eldridge, who famously on a blindfold test said, I've listened to it stoned, I've listened to it drunk, I've listened to it straight. It doesn't make any sense. Well, he should have known better,
Yep.
But there were a lot of people like that. And Late Train, still to this day, Late Coltrane, I was incensed to read Jeff Dwyer's essay in the New York Review of Books, where he said about the last Coltrane record offering that live concert, Temple University, I think. He said Coltrane had gone too far. Now, how can anybody who's go too far with their art?
Right.
What does that can only mean that the journalist is not able to go there with them. And if a critic cannot enlighten about something that an artist has done, then that criticism does not seem to have any validity to my mind. I mean,
I agree.
You can say I don't get it. If you say it's no good, that's something else.
Yeah, the job in quotes is to illuminate. Not to criticize. Not to say, well, I mean, obviously, you can point things out, but the fundamental job is to illuminate, not to say, well, he's gone too far, which is quite a concept in art.
Don't look at that Picasso. It's stupid. It's like, here's, Coltrane devoted much more of his life to jazz than Jeff Dwyer has done, or than I have done. I mean, maybe he's got something to teach us. Maybe where he's going, with his dedication is something we should follow. We might not know how to get there. So we should talk to our peers who have also listened to this music with such devotion and lent themselves to it to try to find out what's going on there, to have that discussion. That's something good about the JJA. This week I wrote to one of my colleagues, JJA member, about a record that I did not like at all. Then the next day I saw that he had promoted it. Mm-hmm. And I needed to hear about what he liked about it. Mm-hmm. So I'm having that discussion on email.
Well, and one other important function, I think, of writing is to educate the listener how devoted the musicians are. It's there's still this myth that of the wild, unbridled talent that just comes out of nowhere, and that never happens. No. There's always unbelievable. Even it may not be formal study in a conservatory sometimes. There's always tremendous study and practice. I was talking with Maxine Gordon the other day, helping her get ready for a trip to Cuba, and people would always ask her, well, what was Dexter like at home? And she said, well, he liked, this show, he liked to do this, he liked to do that, and he practiced all the time, and that's something that I think enhances the appreciation and then ultimately the enjoyment of the music, to know that you may not get the particular music at a particular time. You may not get it. Well, that's fine. But do know that the people making it are very serious about what they're doing, and they've put a lot into it. It's not just some natural. That's the thing I just hate to hear. That it's natural. Well, it's
not. It's difficult to play a saxophone well. It takes breath. To keep something like that in tune is difficult. It really takes work. I mean, anybody who's tried it, you can't just pick up a trumpet, stick it in your mouth, and suddenly play anything. I mean, you have to work to get a good sound. And if you get one good sound, that's nice. But then think about a solo that has, a zillion notes in it, and a shape, and a relationship to the other people who are playing. all that stuff can be brought out by good writing.
Absolutely.
Or good talking. And people who just, like I said, when I was teaching, I realized that some people just heard music as a big cloud, that it was just like all kind of happening at once. And they didn't even understand it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. They were not aware of the narrative of it. They could not hear the bottom sounds and the top sounds. They just didn't have a way. Nobody taught them or suggested to them that there are different sort of levels of activity going on and dimensions. And to me, I've lived with that and I've learned about it and I've studied it, and it fascinates me, the interactions, almost like sociological, but a lot of people don't bother to scratch the surface that way. And, the same as looking at a painting and then thinking about how the colors work together or don't, or how the sort of the rhythm of the painting, it's just, there's a lot more to get out of it.
And this is the role of writers and educators, which really are kind of the same thing, not to tell people what to think or how to think or what to feel or how to feel, but just point out the craft in it that's involved, whether it's color or whether it's sound, so that they have a way of addressing it. It's not this cloud. That's a very good point. I think uninformed, uneducated, music must seem just like this cloud to people, whereas there's a lot of structure to it, obviously. I mean, it's all structure, really, whether it's improvised or not. And the more you know, the more you can hear in it, and the more you can enjoy it.
That's right.
If somebody's out there and they're aspiring to be a jazz writer, or they already are doing some jazz writing, I think clearly JJA is a place for people to congregate and to approach about membership. And it sounds like you've got a lot of great support, professional development for members. Does somebody have to be like a highfalutin successful jazz writer to join?
Not at all. Not at all. We have no restrictions on membership. We do have different classes of membership. There are professional members. There are associate members, that is, people who are not they're not trying to be jazz journalists. They're just maybe other support organizations or staffers, or, they do something else, but they want to support the organization. And we have a student membership level also for people who are still in school and who are looking at getting into the profession. But we don't have, 3 published pieces before you can join or anything like that. If you think you're a jazz journalist, we want you. And we want you to take part in, what the organization does.
Great. This
so we,
year,
tried to reach out to bloggers. We did a lot of work on trying to stimulate videography on a very local level. Even just using your phone, how you could take photos or videos of local jazz situations, not performances only, but, show us where the club is, talk to the audience, tell us something about this musician, keep it short, title it, and put it up on YouTube so people can see it, and put it on your Facebook page and put it on your Instagram. Just trying to explode how much journalism about jazz is out there, how many views of the music and its whole echo state are available. I think we need to populate media with news and views about this music.
Great. And a term that I popped into my head last year, and I'm sure it's not unique to me, but I'm starting to think about all this as jazz activism. If you're a writer, you're a jazz activist. If you're educating people about jazz, you're a jazz activist. If you're going out to hear live music and then buying the CDs after the show, you're a jazz activist. And so anybody that considers themselves, or let's put it this way, now that you've heard the definition, you may realize that in fact it's more than being a fan. Fan is almost like a passive thing. Whereas an activist is somebody that's listening and doing something to help push the art forward or support it. And it can come in any form. It can come in any form. And just being an audience member is already, you're on the road to being an activist. But if somebody's listening to this and they're inclined to do more, there are infinite opportunities. Unfortunately, as we've talked about earlier, they don't pay. But, hey, a lot of things don't pay, and we do them anyway because they're enjoyable. So I love this idea of, if you're in a town and it has a good club, maybe the club isn't well documented, you could work with the club owner, maybe to be the official YouTube correspondent for that club. And
yeah, or you could just do it even without mentioning it to the club owner. You can just do it. I mean, it's becoming part of the community. I think I liked at the very beginning when you emphasized the role of the audience, of audience members, interplay that musicians create. Audience members, I mean, jazz journalists come out of the audience, and we are part of the audience.
Yep.
If we have clients, they are the audience. That's our readership. That's the people that we need to be clear to, that we need to engage. It's nice if a musician likes what you've written about them. It's more important if somebody who's listening says, I got something out of that. Now it enhanced my experience. Now I have a better understanding about how to listen to somebody or something. I think that's what I'm looking for. And those people become community members. There's something about community that is very immediate and tangible. It's more than a fan. I don't just show up with a million other fans. All of us million fans, we believe in this music and the values that it proposes and the standards that it's set up, and we're trying to, be part of that. We want to align with it. To me, it's as real as being, in the neighborhood and being a good neighbor. If you're a good jazz community member, you don't have to love everything. You can say nasty things about anybody you want. You can shun some music, but you're involved. You're engaged. You know what you're doing with it. You know why, and that's much more active than it is passive.
And the music depends on this activism. If you look, for instance, take a city like New Orleans. Why does New Orleans have such a rich scene? It's because there's so many educated, involved audience members that are supporting the music in countless ways. And, there's no blueprint for how to do it. There's no one way to do it. Every contribution is important from whatever angle it's coming from. And when a community gets that critical mass of people, suddenly, magic happens, I think.
Well, it's a benevolent circle also. It's not just, us giving something to the music to keep the music alive. I mean, the people in New Orleans know what they get out of that music. It lifts their spirits. It makes the food taste better. It what you want to listen to if you're down or if you're up. You know how music works as a social lubricant. You understand something better about people's interpersonal relationships. If you understand a jazz quartet, you know how to stand in an elevator when there's three other people you never met before going up to the 100th floor with you. You kind of set up, I'm the bass player here. I'm not going to be fiddling around with my necktie or, I'm just going to be cool. I mean, it's all of that stuff is a metaphor. I mean, jazz is a wonderful experience, human endeavor that lets us draw lessons from it for how to act in other human endeavors. It's the cooperation, the collaboration, the interplay. I just find it unique. It's unparalleled. I mean, I've tried often to think of other kinds of arts that have similar attributes. Modern dance, improvised modern dance, comedy improv. But improvised theater, very little of that. I mean, mostly people are sticking to a script. Movies, no, this is, all done in the studio. It's all frozen. What is the immediate, creative, multi-layered, multi-leveled art form in real time? It's jazz or other live performance that involves multiple people in a improvised setting where they get to choose the grammar, or maybe not the grammar, maybe the phonetics, the words they use. They don't dictate the form, but they dictate the content. Everybody comes up with their own content.
And also people from widely divergent backgrounds can meet in jazz. The great historical meeting of Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo.
Sure.
Chano really didn't speak English, and Dizzy didn't really speak Spanish. but somehow they were able to get it together and make amazing music. And you multiply that over a 1,000 varieties of that experience. So, we've got something great, and I think that's why so many of us are doing everything we can to promote it and create an environment for it to flourish. Wow, we're going to have to have a part 2 to this, and I hope we can. Now, if people want to to keep up with jazz journalists, should they go to jazzjournalist.org?
jjanews.org.
Oh, jjanews.org.
Or the Jazz Journalists Association's Facebook page.
Okay, great. And there's super content on all these sites as well. And I want to encourage people that are doing any writing at all, definitely look into membership. And then if you're not a writer, but you're an activist, a jazz activist, in whatever form that takes, consider becoming an associate member. This is a great platform for people that love the music and want to participate in helping it flourish. Thank you so much for this time and for all your decades of work in this field. And this call was very illuminating for me, too.
My pleasure.
Great. And we'll see you around the internet and hopefully in a club. I'll have to go to Chicago to do that now.
Well, I travel a little bit. But thanks, Ken. Thanks for getting in touch.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please share it. That's how we grow. And remember to subscribe to JazzOnTheTube.com, the Internet's largest collection of free, streamable, classic jazz videos.